I'll be welcoming some of our colleagues from the newsroom here in just a few minutes to chat about the One Big Beautiful Bill and what that means for Minnesota and our state, talking about some of the coverage they've done, what they're looking at, and so forth, and bringing you into this issue. But first, I'll welcome you to this MinnPost Social. My name is Tanner Curl. I'm the executive director of MinnPost. If you don't know, we are a nonprofit, independent newsroom that serves as a trusted guide for Minnesotans as they explore the critical issues, challenges, and opportunities facing our state, including policy from the federal level, which is the focus today. The conversation is going to be led by our deputy editor, Dan Haugen, who's relatively new to MinnPost. This is his first MinnPost Social. He'll be talking with our Washington Correspondent Ana Radelat, and then various other members of our newsroom in terms of their coverage areas and how this, pretty sweeping piece of federal legislation will impact our state. Before we get into that great conversation, I do want to thank our MinnPost Social series sponsors. That includes RBC Wealth Management and Darla Cashin. Darla and RBC have been longtime supporters of this series. We really appreciate their support and partnership. We also want to thank our longtime partners at Great River Energy for being MinnPost Social Series sponsors. That type of support makes conversations like this possible, but also supports our paywall-free journalism year-round as well. So thank you to RBC Wealth Management, Darla Cashin, and Great River Energy. Of course, if you're interested in sponsoring or your business is interested in sponsoring MinnPost, we'd love to chat about opportunities, but anybody can support our work. And I know, looking at this list, we have a lot of MinnPost members who are joining for this conversation today. Membership is also a really important part of what we do, the journalism that we produce, and our ability to make that journalism free and accessible for all Minnesotans, either directly through MinnPost or with republication partners and community outlets across the state. So if you're interested, if you're already a part of our work via membership, thank you. If you're not, you can join our team, get in our corner by making a tax-deductible donation of any amount at minnpost.com/support. I also want to put a little plug in. If you enjoy this conversation, we're going to have a lot more conversations like this at MinnPost Festival, which is coming up on Saturday, September 27th at Westminster Presbyterian Church in downtown Minneapolis. We have some big keynotes coming in, including Governor Tim Walz in conversation with New York Times journalist Lulu Garcia-Navarro. We're going to have Senator Tina Smith in conversation with journalist and podcaster Kara Swisher. We have other great conversations looking at disinformation with Barbara Quaid and Andy Luger. We're going to have Emily Nussbaum, staff writer at The New Yorker, talking about culture and media and politics and how those things intersect with each other, particularly around reality television, which will be really interesting. We have House Speaker Lisa Damith, Attorney General Keith Ellison, Shonda Smith-Baker from St. Paul, Minnesota Foundation. I should have this listed in front of me because I'm sure I'm forgetting Tyler Pager for the New York Times. We have a lot of great guests, more to be added even. And for the next week through September 2nd, we have early bird pricing discounts on festival passes. If you're a member, that includes an even further discount. You can learn all about it by going to minnpost.com/festival. You can see the lineup. You can click through to get that early bird discount on tickets through September 2nd. And if you're a member, you get an even extra discount. So if you're a member and you need that code, email members@minnpost.com to get the code for an even further discount on passes. But make sure you get there before September 2nd to get that early bird pricing locked in. And we're excited for that. With all of that, I'm going to hand things over to my newsroom colleagues, and particularly to start this conversation, I'm going to ask Dan Haugen, our deputy editor, and Ana Radelat, our Washington correspondent, to turn on your video and unmute yourselves and welcome you to the, virtual stage. And Dan, I'll hand it over to you to moderate the conversation.
Thank you, Tanner. Yeah, and thank you, Anna, and the rest of our reporting team for being here to help us uh, start to understand the significance of this law in Minnesota. So I suspect most people here are familiar with some of the big ticket items in this legislation, the ICE and military spending, the tax cuts, some of the big changes to social service programs such as Medicaid and food stamps. So it's my understanding that Minnesota and the entire country is going to be feeling the impacts of this bill for quite a while. Uh, Anna, you've been covering this bill now for a couple of months, or has it been several weeks? When did this pass again?
Well,
July. Was
it's
it just last month?
yeah, it was but it was signed on July 4th. So
So
it was
yeah,
passed on July 3rd in the last passage because it bounced back and forth because of changes. But this bill has been coming for a long time, from, almost since Trump was inaugurated. And the first thing to understand is why he needed the bill and why it was done in this way.
hmm,
Because you have to look at the policy of the bill, but you also have to look at the politics of the bill. And there are going to be ramifications on both sides in Minnesota. Um, so, it was done under reconciliation, which means the Democrats couldn't filibuster it in the Senate. And it was a very dicey bill for both Republicans and Democrats in Minnesota. The Democrats knew that, the cuts to social programs were going to really hurt their core, ideology and their core principles of, having a safety net program for people. And the Republicans were also, wary of that too, the Republicans in the state, because, some of these SNAP cuts are going to be hitting rural Minnesota more than anyone else. But Trump needed to pass this legislation because he could not do everything by executive order. And this sets his agenda up in such a way that these things are not going to be able to be challenged in the courts, unlike all the executive orders that Keith Ellison, joins in these lawsuits, which have had a pretty decent success rate. Not total success, but they've been able to slow some of Trump's agenda. This won't be slowed by, you know, lawsuits. This will be more difficult because it is congressionally mandated. Um,
can tell me about some of the questions that you've been asking and the reporting that you've been doing over the last couple of months here as we start to kind of unpack the impact of this large bill.
well, I guess I'm asking the same questions that all reporters are asking, which is, how does this affect the communities? How does this affect state budgets? How does this affect, for instance, the Medicaid cuts have a far-reaching effect, not just the recipients, but providers, clinics, especially rural hospitals, urban hospitals that, serve as safety net hospitals. So that's the kind of thing that we look at, who is going to be most affected, um, and determine, you know, how that works.
So, part of this, what this bill did was make permanent several tax cuts. Could you talk about the tax impact of this legislation on Minnesotans and Americans?
Well, that was the big impetus for the bill was that Trump's tax cuts, which he implemented in his first term, were going to expire at the end of this year. So he, unlike those first term tax cuts that expired, had an expiration date, these will go on forever, which is a big concern for people who care about, uh, you know, budget deficits and the debt, the national debt. So they are mostly permanent, but the ones that he offered to lower income people. The no tax on overtime, the no tax on tips, the, giving a tax break. It is not a no tax on Social Security, but he did give a tax break to people who are over, older Americans who are on Social Security. Um, those are not permanent. Those will disappear in a few years. So the impact on Minnesotans is depending on your income level. Now, if you're a property owner, there's a thing in this tax bill that will help because it allows you more of a deduction on your state and local taxes, which some moderate Republicans had been fighting for, and that will affect some Minnesotans. The so-called salt tax cap or the salt cap has been lifted, not eliminated, lifted. So if you pay a lot of taxes, local taxes, property taxes, if you're making, if you're earning a good salary, um, you will benefit. If you're lower income, less so. And you have to remember that the people who do survive on tips, they only have a break for a little while.
You did some reporting recently on the pieces of this bill that relate to farmers and how it sounds like there's some good and bad so far for farmers this year under the Trump administration. Can you talk about what farmers like about what was in this bill and what they're maybe more concerned about still? Things
Yes.
that are not addressed in the bill.
Well, we're about 3 years overdue on a farm bill. I guess this would be the third year that we don't have a farm bill yet. And the farmers are very upset about that. And they're very upset or worried about Trump's trade policies, the tariffs, especially with China, which has been a big export market for the state's hog and soybean producers. So they weren't very happy with some of Trump's policies. And their prospects in this very, very polarized Congress are very poor for a farm bill, which needs bipartisan support. Um, so Trump, in the big, beautiful bill, put $64 billion to shore up the farm safety net. That's, subsidies and adding and expanding the crop insurance program and a host of other programs that farmers, ranchers, dairymen had been really seeking in a farm bill. So the bill gave them a good chunk of the farm bill. But at the same time, it's going to probably reduce spending on SNAP, on food stamps. And farmers like that program a lot because, people who are using food stamps are buying groceries, and groceries, is good. Buying food is good for farmers. So they're not happy with that. But they're very happy with the provisions that, give them greater subsidies and fix some of the problems that they wanted fixed in a farm bill.
I want to take a moment to note that we are going to be taking questions in the second part of this program. We already have a lot of good questions submitted from the audience in advance. If you would like to share a question for Ana or the rest of the MinnPost reporting team, you can do that in the Zoom chat, and we'll be monitoring the chat for questions. I probably have a couple more questions for Ana, and then we'll start introducing the rest of the team here. So all of the Republican members of Congress from Minnesota ultimately voted for this bill. In your reporting and in following this vote, how enthusiastic or reluctant were they? How did they talk publicly about their votes for this bill?
Well, a lot of them, well, there, a lot of messaging from the Republicans, and the Republicans in Minnesota are not different from that. But mostly they talked about how great these tax breaks would be. That if you did not pass this bill, people would get a tax hike because the breaks that Trump put it in his first term of office would expire, and some people would have higher tax bills. So that was a very effective message. If we didn't pay for this, if we didn't vote for this, you'd be paying higher taxes. Very effective. The other thing is, they also said, look, we're not cutting the social safety net programs. We're just getting able-bodied people who should be working, and we're getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse, which is always, a way. They never said, we're cutting Medicaid, we're cutting food stamps, we're cutting other programs. They couched it as, needed reforms in these programs to make them run better.
And how much evidence have we seen reported about the actual existence of that waste and fraud and abuse um, uh, versus these changes having real impacts on Minnesotans?
Well, I mean, there are many studies on work requirements, which is the basic thing that was done, expanding work requirements in on food stamps. They already exist. These are expanded, and uh, and implementing work requirements for Medicaid, which is new. And they found with food stamps that and Medicaid that most people on these programs already work. What's going to change is their reporting requirements. They're going to have to report more often. They're going to have to do more paperwork. They're going to have to, and so some people may not keep up with it and will fall off the rolls. Now, is there fraud? I'm sure, but it's negligible. I mean, we're talking about huge programs, national programs with a lot of money and a lot of recipients. Yeah, are there some people on there? Sure. People cheat on their taxes too. Um, you know, does it mean you eliminate the tax system? Um, so yeah, I guess that's all I can say about that.
Okay. And who will be responsible for administering these work requirements and other new administrative tasks?
Um, well, they're going to the states administer both Medicaid and SNAP. SNAP, the payout until this bill was passed, the federal government paid for all the benefits of food stamps. And the federal government and the state shared the cost of administration. That is now going to shift. Also, they're punishing states which have error rates by making them pay for some of the cost of the benefit of food stamps.
Does
So that
Minnesota have what is Minnesota's error rate compared to other states?
I think the last time I looked it up for 2024, it was 8%. The
Is
national
that
rate,
notable or?
the national rate is 10%, but anybody over a 6% error rate will be punished. So if you have anything between 6 and 10%, you're going to have to pay 5% of the Medicaid costs. I think it's 5%. And then from 10 to 15%, you have to pay 10% of the Medicaid cost, and so on, except to help win the vote for the Alaska senator, not to get too much in the weeds, but all of a sudden, if you have a tremendously large error rate like Alaska does, you don't have to pay. So what states should do is really ramp up their error rates. Um,
You
but
want a very low error rate or an extremely high one?
an extremely high one. Yes, that was to get Lisa Murkowski to sign on to the plan.
So this seems like a good point to bring in our senior state government reporter, Matthew Blake. Matthew has been following some of the impact of this bill on Minnesota state government and has done some good reporting for us. Matt, could you tell us, just share an example of one of the storylines that you've been following in terms of the One Big Beautiful Bill's impact on Minnesota state government?
Sure. Yeah. To jump off of from what Anna said, the first One Big Beautiful Bill story, or one of the first, I should say, that I did looked at that question of how to administer these changes in Medicaid. And so right now in the state of Minnesota, there's a system where the counties actually determine the eligibility for Medicaid and food stamps, and then they work with state agencies and then assessing who is eligible and who is not eligible. And so these work requirements that Anna was talking about, the fear here in Minnesota, at least, or at least the stated fear by the Walz administration, is less a bunch of people are going to lose their health care because they're not working. Rather, the fear is a bunch of people are going to lose their health care because they're not properly filling in forms showing that they are working. So right now, the Minnesota Department of Human Services is working with the state's 80-some counties in developing basically a system in which they can follow federal guidelines and demonstrate to the federal government, which provides roughly half of Medicaid funding, that the people getting Medicaid are in fact working or meeting a community service requirement or education requirement. So that's a huge part of the One Big Beautiful Bill. And I would just also say, in addition to that, in terms of just the healthcare provision, the One Big Beautiful Bill does, and Anna and I have both done reporting on this, does like restrict who is eligible for Medicaid, including people who've been recently granted asylum, people who are refugees, people kind of in these temporary immigration status categories used to be able to apply for Medicaid, and starting next year no longer will be able to.
Great, thank you, Matthew. That seems like a good point to bring in our health and racial equity reporter, Deanna Pistano. Deanna, you've also been keeping tabs on some of the Medicaid changes and how they might impact various communities in Minnesota. Could you talk a bit about what you have been paying attention to as we anticipate the impacts from this law here?
Sure. It's also Pistono.
Apology.
All right. In terms of, well, a lot has been spoken about already, so I won't belabor the points that my colleagues have already made so eloquently. The reality is that cuts regarding healthcare which are going to take place in various ways or have already taken place in various ways, are going to impact large swaths of people in various ways. There are some things that are currently effectively so delayed that they've been effectively blocked on enactment as a result. So we've got the Medicare Savings Program coverage. There was going to be a rule implemented to sort of streamline that a bit more, and which would have made low-income people more able to get Medicare, along with a rule about having enough staff members in nursing homes to keep health and safety. Those have all been delayed so far in the future to the effect that they've been blocked on enactment. Clinics that provide abortion are also blocked from receiving Medicaid payments. I'm sure everybody knows about the Hyde Amendment, which is the federal government can't fund abortion care unless in cases of rape or incest or a life-threatening pregnancy. And so already the funds weren't able to go to abortion directly. So this means that providers can't provide other services via Medicaid as well if they also provide abortion. So it's things like screening for HIV or various types of cancers. There's a massive cost we pay there in terms of human suffering, but also in terms of finances down the line. And the reality is that as well as that Black and Hispanic people make up larger proportions of Medicaid recipients compared to their proportions within the demographic makeup of the US as a whole. So Medicaid also pays for a lot of long-term care and maternal health and for nursing, home care, and services. So the reality is we're looking at a lot of chronic conditions, and the impact is going to be felt among various populations. There's always a gap in enforcement, so it's some of these, and as well as some of these just having later start dates in terms of when these specific requirements get enacted. So we're not seeing these now, but the reality with health is there's always going to be a knock-on effect. Like people not being able to manage their conditions now is going to lead to higher costs later on in terms of human suffering and in terms of finances as we see more emergency room visits. Or that's speculation, but I would not be surprised if that occurs.
Thank you, Deanna. Yeah, a big theme, there's a lot from this law that is putting more work and funding requirements on state and local government. Winter Kiefer is our Metro reporter. Winter, wondering if you could speak a bit about some of the impacts you're paying attention to on local government here in the Metro.
Sure, definitely. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of the trickle-down effect, and right now, obviously, there are a lot of unknowns around the One Big Beautiful Bill. But one of the bigger ones that I've been looking at is the impact of a phase-out of provisions through the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, specifically around entities that qualify for what's called elective pay. And so elective pay is for, essentially, it's for tax-exempt entities that are looking to get tax credits for projects that are centered around energy and climate. And to Anna's point, locally, what we've seen prior to the bill itself, it is true that Trump needed to pass legislation in order to do things that he couldn't do via executive order. So just a few weeks before the bill passed, actually local entities were involved in a lawsuit that was ruled in favor for them. Specifically, a federal judge ruled that that it was unconstitutional to have these grants exempt, no longer applicable. Yeah, held up. And so, and that was in June. And so now that it's passed, the question mark is, will there be able to be litigious challenges against that? Basically, it was ruled that, $180 million of environmental funding needed to be restored to 3 regional organizations, one of them based in Minneapolis. And the kicker of that was that, the other organizations outside of the group that was included in that lawsuit wouldn't benefit from that ruling. So that's kind of where there are just a million question marks that still apply as far as how this is going to affect local entities, especially around initiatives over climate. And that's where the local end really is waffling and trying to figure out what to do, is just how do we keep these grant programs alive when entities that are tax exempt no longer qualify for the tax credits. That repeal is still going to take effect over a period of time. But in general, a lot of agencies and municipalities are struggling to figure out how to maintain that programming, some of which they were planning to do in the span of a decade.
Thank you, Winter. Another reminder about questions. We're keeping tabs on questions in the Zoom chat. We're going to pivot to audience questions in just a few minutes here. Want to bring in our Greater Minnesota reporter, Brian Arla. Brian is, you've got your camera working, great. Brian, tell me what this is looking like in Greater Minnesota.
Yeah, in Greater Minnesota, the big things looming large are on the Medicaid and SNAP fronts. With Medicaid, I wrote a story about rural hospitals and the reliance they have on Medicaid. In one case, a hospital in Hibbing, hospital system in Hibbing in Grand Rapids up in northern Minnesota received about 25% of their revenue from Medicaid. So any impacts to that really will hit hard. And the administrator's point when I talked to her was that just because you're not on Medicaid doesn't mean this won't affect you. Because if the hospital in your rural community where access to care is already a challenge, is impacted by this, it could very well lead to cuts down the road or some lack of services that other people who aren't on Medicaid rely on. And then with SNAP, it's a similar thing where many rural Minnesota counties have very high SNAP participation rates, up to 20% on the high end, and then above 10% is pretty common too. Northwest Minnesota in particular has some counties that are very, very reliant on SNAP. And so if you have people getting cut off of that due to higher requirements, it'll have this spill-on effect impacting the recipients themselves, the grocery store that has a high reliance on SNAP revenue to cover their bills and all of that. So those are some of the major impacts. And then, of course, that county piece that others have touched on, where counties administer these programs, and many of these counties are quite stretched resource-wise and don't have a ton of resources to cover costs that may be put on them now to administer these costs. So those will all be really, really closely watched for me in Greater Minnesota.
Great, thank you, Brian. And lastly, I want to bring in our data reporter, Shadi Bushra, who has been helping us with crunch all and map all of these numbers over the last couple of months. Shadi, what does this look like from your perspective?
So I guess it's speaking about the administration and the beginning of Trump 2.0 more broadly than, specifically the one big beautiful bill. It's made my job harder to get data, to find data that's credible, to talk to experts who are willing to put their faith in that kind of data and speak to it. And just to back up, there are good reasons for the federal government to collect data, and it's lauded around the world for its data collection and methodology and the robustness of its data sets. So it's been a real backslide at the federal level. There's been a lot less data available, and there has also been a decline in the perceived credibility of the data that's out there. So as an example of some of the data that was taken down within the first month of the administration, the Environmental Protection Agency has a environmental justice map, and that was taken down in February. And there has been pushback from the data community, data journalists, academics, researchers. And so they took backups of that data and they put it up on their own website. So now there's a privately run server that's reflecting this government data that's no longer available. In other cases, courts have forced the government to put data back up online. So the CDC keeps track of youth behavioral and health wellness. And some of the questions touch on things such as gender identity, sexual identity, things that are not something the current administration wants measured necessarily or talked about too broadly. So a court did order them to put that data back up, and that was part of the basis for a recent story we did on transgender rights in Minnesota. And there is a perceived decrease in the credibility of the data. And I say perceived because a lot of the people who work with this stuff, and that includes everyone from researchers, academics, business and market analysts, all the way to state and local government officials who rely on it to make predictions, to see what the tax base will look like for the coming 5 years, see what they can expect in revenue. Those people generally understand that even if there is shuffling at the top, people are getting fired at the Bureau of Labor Statistics or trying to be fired at the Fed. They understand that most of that agency is made up of committed civil servants. The methodology still is the same, no matter who's at the top. And so they broadly do trust that data. But if you are somebody who is not so in tune with what's going on and don't know how to cross-check those statistics with other sources, it looks chaotic, and it looks like the data is either untrustworthy because the president said it's untrustworthy, or it's untrustworthy because the president's now installed his own person to run that agency. And so for the public, it's very confusing, and it's in a way sown sort of broader distrust in government information writ large, not just the government data. So it's made it a little bit harder, but we've had to get more creative. So
as we try to measure the impact of this law, that could get challenging because of some of the uncertainty created around the federal data. Great, thank you, Shadi. So we've got a good solid 20 minutes here for audience questions. We're going to try to get to as many as we can. A lot of these will be directed at Ana, but other reporters feel free to jump in as you have thoughts to add. So we have a question from Rachel who says, assuming most of the impact will be to social problems, if Minnesota had tighter controls regarding fraud, waste, and government abuse, would that impact be different? Matt, this might be a question best for you. Could you address that question?
Yeah, sure. In terms of like what Minnesota has to combat fraud, waste, and abuse right now, there's a legislative audit commission that reveals the work of the state legislature and also by extension state agencies. Then the biggest state agencies have their own inspector general. That includes the Minnesota Department of Human Services. In terms of whether Minnesota could better manage its social problems through less fraud, I think Ana put it well earlier that, yeah, of course it can. I mean, I think anyone would be for having less waste, fraud, and abuse in the government. The question is, what significance does it actually have overall in taking away funding or misusing funding? We did have a big scandal in Minnesota this summer with the neighborhood housing program under Medicaid, which the Department of Human Services, after their own internal investigation, shut down. And that probably cost the state of Minnesota north of $100 million. So that would be an instance of a major instance of mismanaged money. But I think that overall, the Medicaid program in Minnesota, the food stamp program in Minnesota, they're so big in size that there's an inevitability that waste, fraud, and abuse will happen. And the question is how quick will the state of Minnesota be in terms of rooting out that waste, fraud, and abuse? I think that the issue here is just sort of the swiftness of the inspector generals within the state agencies and just the ability of counties and states to work together in administering a good program. But there will always be instances, no matter what party is in power, there will always be instances of waste, fraud, and abuse. There will always be inspector general reports, public audits, dinging whatever parties in power about waste, fraud, and abuse. And so it's really important for us as journalists, instead of just uncritically writing up those reports and talking about something like it's the worst thing in the world, to put those reports in proportion to the rest of federal spending and state spending. And in terms of state spending in Minnesota right now, waste, fraud, and abuse, at least in Medicaid, is only about 5% of the cost of the program here.
Thank you, Matt. A question from Kristen who asks, this is probably a good question for Ana. What are the differences between this spending bill and the rescission bill? Can you help us understand the difference between those two, between One Big Beautiful Bill and the rescission bill? Oh, you're muted, Ana.
One's an appropriations bill and one's a budget bill. The Big Beautiful Bill is not, sets levels of of spending for all the agencies, okay? And set some, levels of spending, but Congress still has to come up with the appropriations bills. And they haven't been able to do that in nearly 20 years. So what we end up doing is expanding last year's budget or doing an omnibus bill, one big bill at the end of the year that has everything. But the committees in Congress have been unable for a long time to do their work, to come up with budgets for all the agencies. Senate has one, House has one, then they get reconciled. Every single agency. There are 13 committees in the House and Senate that do these bills. So there are going to be problems again this year. We can look for a shutdown, possible shutdown of the federal government on September 30th. So those are appropriations bills. This was just a budget bill extending policies and setting the baseline numbers for the federal agencies. The rescission bill is something else. It is like an appropriation bill, but negative. Instead of giving to agencies, it takes away. It takes away from Congress appropriates XYZ for this department, and then the rescission bill comes along and takes away XYZ from that department. So it's like a negative appropriations bill. But once again, since if Congress passes it, it's not something that the president tries to do through executive action, which could be challenged since he's abrogating the power of Congress. Since Congress does it, it's okay.
That's interesting. Thank you, Anna. We've got a question from Vicky who asks, how can we communicate the negative impacts of this bill to our neighbors in rural communities whose representatives voted in favor of this bill? I guess as journalists, we can't address the communication strategy, but Brian or Anna or Matt, maybe, if any of you have thoughts on kind of just what you're hearing in rural Minnesota about how people are talking about this law.
I can say that the bad part, the things that might harm the people in rural Minnesota, SNAP cuts will come in first, but Medicaid cuts will come in December of 2026. That's nearly 2 months after the midterms. So, and that was, I think, done on purpose, with a purpose. So that, people who might change their ideas about their local representative who voted for this bill because they find that now they have to fill out all these forms or lose their Medicaid, or, the rural hospital is closing because, there's not enough people left on Medicaid in that area. That's not going to be effective till after the midterm. So, I think what has to be done is that people have to, time will tell on this. They're going to have to feel the effects of this bill before they, can deal with supporting or not supporting what their local Republican has done.
Brian, how does that resonate with what you are hearing? You're based in Mankato and spend a lot of time driving around Minnesota.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with what Anna said, and really, it'll come down to continuing to have a presence in these communities. Which, as a Greater Minnesota reporter, some of that will fall on me. Just getting out to these communities, hearing from local officials as these things start to have real world effects. Following that and continuing to hear what it's like on the ground there, checking back with that hospital and checking back with the county administrators and the people on SNAP who are facing these heightened burdens, and then reporting it and bringing it to our audience. From what I was hearing on my travels so far, some of it was at, or a lot of it was at Farm Fest, where you're hearing from farmers, and so they're reacting quite narrowly to the provisions in the bill that they like. And less so reacting to the things that they don't like. And then they're also talking about how they still want a farm bill. So they're saying, we got a good portion of what we wanted in this, but we still want a farm bill, and they were a little bit, I would say, less willing to talk about the other sides of it that maybe weren't as palatable, because as farmers they were seeing some of these things that they had wanted for a long time come through in these provisions in the bill.
Thanks, Brian. Next, got a very important question from BJ that I'm going to kick to Tanner Curl, our executive director. Is MinnPost losing any funding due to the One Big Beautiful Bill?
No, is the short answer to that. MinnPost, we receive funding from, I'll say it again, MinnPost members, individual donors, grant funders, sponsors, advertisers, but we do not receive funding from the federal government or state government. Those impacts are much more focused on public radio, public television, and I'll specifically, Brian did some reporting on that, so I direct people to that, but also I did see we actually have Chelsea Perkins from KAXE joining us for this event and just highlighting, even beyond the impacts on, Twin Cities PBS, Minnesota Public Radio, they've announced layoffs based on those cuts and the rescission bill that rescinded already allocated federal funding through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. But it's those community outlets like KAXE up in Grand Rapids in northern Minnesota. There's others throughout the state, including in the metro, that will have an even bigger impact on them. And so, they are looking at and actively working at how to bridge that gap and move forward. But in terms of direct impact on us, no, we don't receive federal or state funding, so we're not affected by it directly.
Thank you, Tanner. Got a question from Don, who would like to know, knowing that many of the provisions of this bill don't kick in until after the midterm, how do we think this is going to affect the midterm elections? And we can't predict. We don't know what exactly is going to happen. But Anna, you've been starting to write about some of the candidates, any indication yet of how candidates in the midterm elections are going to be talking about this bill?
Well, I think Democrats are going to be talking about it a lot more than Republicans. Republicans, they have been talking about it even before the bill was drafted in the earliest form in the House of Representatives. So we're talking months and months and months of Democrats, being outraged by, the weakening of the social safety net. So they're going to keep that. They're going to keep talking about it, even if some of the provisions aren't implemented yet. And Republicans, if they talk about it, they will continue to focus on the needs for reform, on the needs to cut federal spending, which is always very popular, and the needs for those tax breaks. Those tax breaks are going to be implemented before the election, so people will be very happy with them.
So the tax breaks are coming before the election.
Yes.
The
April 14th.
Program impacts will be after. So
right.
We'll
April
get
14th, when you fill out, or before that, if you're really good, you're filling out your tax forms, you will be, for a lot of people, it won't change because this is once again an extension of the, but if those tax breaks hadn't been passed on April 14th, people would have had a tax hike, and they would have looked to Trump and said, oh, Trump and the Republicans gave me a tax hike.
I've got a related question from the chat from Jack. This is another one for you, Anna. Will the temporary increase on the standard deduction for seniors have an impact on Minnesota state tax revenue? As in, will seniors be reporting a lower taxable income on their state income tax? That might be too granular. Are you able to speak to that, or is that something we need to look into still?
I have to figure it out, but it seems like I've never filled out. I'm sorry, I don't live in Minnesota. I do Maryland taxes, which are bad enough. But the I know that Maryland does something that Minnesota does not. Maryland exempts Social Security from taxation. So I have never had to deal with that. So if you get a credit for on your Social Security income, then that would lower your federal income. And I really don't know how the state is going to handle that, whether they're going to let that go or make you re-report that $6,000 or whatever it is.
Mhm.
I'm
Might be,
sorry, I have no good
yeah.
answer for that.
It's a good question. Maybe it's something that you and I and Matthew can look into at some point before tax season next time around. Another question from the chat. Let's see here. How does this bill here? I'm going to pair a couple here for you, Anna. We've got a question. How does this bill relate to Project 2025? And another question that says, how does this bill fit into the Trump administration's flood the zone strategy? So a couple questions about kind of how this fits in strategy-wise with the Trump administration.
Well, I have a confession to make. I did not pour through the 2025 Project 2025 document. I probably mistakenly thought it was too outrageous to implement. But it does seem like many of the provisions in Project 2025 have been implemented, both through executive orders and some through the big, beautiful bill. Now, the second part of the question, can you repeat that to me, please?
Second question was, how does this fit into the Trump administration's flood the zone strategy?
Okay, because it's legislation and because it's drafted by Congress, it's less chaotic. This has to go through the process. The bill is drafted, it is signed into law, then the agencies have to go through rulemaking and all this kind of stuff. So there's a process here. Flood the zone to me is more what he says, what he threatens to do, sending troops to Washington, D.C. on the spur of the moment without much foresight, thinking of sending troops to other cities. His executive actions yesterday, what was it? Flag burning, and there's another one. They come so fast that you can't keep up with them. That's flood the zone.
Great. I want to thank everyone who submitted questions. We're going to fit in one more audience question here before we hand things back to Tanner. This question from Gus is a good forward-looking one to end on, I think. And Gus wonders what a restart of funding would look like. So if Democrats retake Congress, retake the White House in 3 or 4 years from now, what does that process look like of resuming or restoring funding that was eliminated in this bill? How straightforward or challenging would it be for Democrats to reverse some of the elements of this bill? Does that make sense?
Is it for me?
Yes, please, Anna. Thanks.
Very difficult from what I can see. If Democrats retake the White House and the House and Senate, to reverse some things, you need money. To restore some cuts, they're going to have to look for money. And since the tax cuts have been made permanent since there's no sunsetting of that provision, they'd have to raise taxes, eliminate some of the tax cuts to get some of the money to put back into the social programs, or find some other revenue stream, or, make the deficit even bigger. So it's going to be very difficult for them. Just getting control of the levers of government and power back isn't going to be enough. They've got to come up with the funds to do that. Now, maybe, raising taxes is not politically popular. So they want to come in and then the first thing they do is raise everybody's taxes. That's going to be hard. Perhaps they could limit something to very high income people. Perhaps they could, do a limited tax hike that wouldn't make everybody upset with them. But I think that's the only thing they could do.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you to the whole MinnPost team and everyone who attending today. I'll hand things back to Tanner now.
Great. Thanks, Dan. And I'll encourage our attendees to give cosmic and literal applause and gratitude to you and all the members of the newsroom for taking time out of your core work to give insights and perspective on this legislation. Our mission is to be that trusted guide, and conversations like this are live in action. I also want to thank our MinnPost Social Series sponsors, RBC Wealth Management, Darla Cashin, as well as Great River Energy. Thank you for making this conversation possible. And I want to thank all of our members who are joining for this event for making our paywall-free journalism possible year-round, all the time, and give another plug for MinnPost Festival coming up on September 27th at Westminster Presbyterian Church. In addition to a lot of special guests and conversations coming in, we'll have our team there. It'll be your opportunity to meet and interact with members of our newsroom and socialize with them a little bit, including Anna, who will be flying in for the event. So we're very excited about that particularly. You can learn more about the festival, including getting in on that early bird member discount at minnpost.com/festival. And with that, again, thanks to our newsroom colleagues for your insights today, and thank you all for being here and engaging in Minnesota's future. Thanks all.